Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sophie Luskin. I am a senior research specialist at Princeton University Center for Information Technology Policy, and I am a senior tech policy analyst at whistleblower law firm Cohn Colapinto. We're so excited to bring to you today this group of whistleblowers and whistleblower advocates to discuss the need for specific AI industry legislation to protect whistleblowers. We'll give you maybe a little bit to filter in, but very excited to have you all here today. Um, So a little background on the AI Whistleblower Protection Act. It was introduced in May by Senate Judiciary Committee Chair Charles Grassley from Iowa. The AI Whistleblower Protection Act seeks to provide explicit whistleblower protections to those developing and deploying AI. Currently, AI employees, restrictive severance, and NDAs have created a chilling effect on current and former employees looking to make whistleblower disclosures to federal government agencies and Congress. Lawmakers now have the opportunity to protect individuals who come forward in good faith and to reinforce the principle that safety, ethics, and accountability must accompany innovation. Whistleblowers serve a valuable and necessary role in congressional oversight, and in an age where AI systems influence everything from elections to defense systems, their protections are now more urgent than ever. With us today, we have Jacob Hilton, former OpenAI employee and transparency advocate, Holly Alpine, former Microsoft employee and co-founder of Enabled Emissions Campaign, Will Alpine, former Microsoft employee and AI specialist, and Jennifer Gibson, co-founder and director of pst.org. And I'll turn it over now to our panelists to introduce themselves and tell you a little bit more about why they're here today. I'll start with you, Jacob.
Hi, yes, my name is Jacob Hilton. I am a technical AI alignment researcher. I work for a small nonprofit in the San Francisco Bay Area. But today I'm mostly here to talk about my experience as an OpenAI employee. So I worked at the company for about 4 years, and when I left, I was given an exit agreement with a non-disparagement clause, together with non-disclosure about the agreement itself, under the threat of losing the vast majority of the compensation I'd been given during for my employment. I was definitely not the only one to receive this agreement. Dozens of others received it, and I wouldn't describe myself as a whistleblower in any sense. But since these agreements became public and OpenAI cancelled them under public pressure, I've spoken up about. I've tried to be an advocate for transparency. I signed a public letter called Right to Warn, where we suggested that companies commit to certain principles to protect whistleblowers and to set up anonymous reporting hotlines and things like that. So yeah, that's my quick intro.
Holly, over to you.
Great, thank you. I'm Holly Alpine, and Will Alpine, who is my husband, not my brother. We spent about 15 years together at Microsoft building global sustainability programs and employee networks. I was on the data center team leading a sustainability program and also co-founded and co-led Microsoft's employee engagement program for sustainability. So got to help 10,000 employees bring sustainability into everything we did at the company. And Will was on the responsible AI team, started the Green AI group. He'll speak more to that. And Microsoft has fantastic sustainability programs and people. We saw that firsthand for many years. But over time, we also saw contracts internally that were extremely troubling to us, how these technologies that are being celebrated for driving decarbonization are also enabling massive increases in fossil fuel production. Microsoft had contracts with a lot of these big oil companies and also smaller companies that were really helping to increase fossil fuel production at every stage of development. Actually, a new Woods Mackenzie study just came out talking about how AI can be used to increase global fossil fuel production by 1 trillion barrels of oil. So that was extremely troubling to us. But speaking up about that contradiction really was not easy. There are powerful narratives around tech companies and sustainability leadership. And this was a company that we cared about deeply, but we also felt this was necessary. So we worked for many years internally before deciding to leave the company and speak up on this issue and push for real accountability.
Thank you,
And maybe
Holly.
over to Will to finish, to
Yes.
bring in some more color.
Thanks, Holly. So I would just like to add some context from the AI lens. I was a product manager on Microsoft's AI platform. So we built the infrastructure and the tools that were powering all of Microsoft AI, as well as significant amount of AI, open AI workloads. And so when I joined, it was really a humble machine learning practice, Azure machine learning. But I was there at the epicenter of the generative AI boom. And so really at the front lines here. So you can think of this AI platform as a Swiss Army knife of AI across the entire life cycle of training, testing, deploying, and monitoring your models. So I really worked at the end, I was on the responsible AI tools team, building the tools that customers were using to deploy AI safely. I also founded the Green AI Group, which was devoted to measuring and reducing the carbon footprint of AI. And we created this group before it became the huge issue that it is today.
I think I'm up, Sophie, right? Hi, I'm Jennifer. I am co-director and co-founder of psst.org or pst.org. We are a nonprofit that provides free legal, security, and storytelling support to those in the tech sector who just want to get a consult. Like I often joke, it's the person sitting at their desk at 11 o'clock at night going, WTF, what am I doing? And what do I do with what I'm doing? Can I get some advice on what my options are here at a very early stage before you even know whether you want to do something, or at a later stage if you've already started to do something and think, wait a minute, I need to get some help. It's a complicated process speaking up. We also talk about and are aiming to try to collectivize the process for these reasons. There's 3 things we've seen in tech over the past several years. Is that regulation is just not coming, or if it's coming very, very slowly. The next thing that's coming is increasingly what I've seen working in the whistleblowing space since Frances Haugen came out with the Facebook files is tech companies have responded by siloing information more and more. So people have pieces of the puzzle, but they don't have the whole story, which makes the decision about whether to speak up even more complicated. And we can talk a little bit about how SB 53 possibly makes that even worse. And then you have the problem, the risks are getting greater and greater. It's not just salary packages that are getting bigger, but corporate surveillance of employees is pervasive, which means your employer knows everything you're looking at and everything you're doing. And the risks of speaking out could be disastrous from a career perspective, right? So what psst.org is trying to do is figure out a way to give those in the tech sector the support they need to understand what their options are, what their risks are, and whether there's a way to speak up without having to go full whistleblower.
Thank you, Jennifer and Will. Now that all of our panelists have introduced themselves, I just wanted to remind the audience that we will be monitoring the Q&A tab on Zoom as well as the live streams. So if you have questions throughout the panel, please put them in that section and we will go over your questions later on. So now we're going to get into the questions for our panelists. What challenges do whistleblowers face when they come forward to share information about corporate wrongdoing or risky behavior?
I'm happy to go first. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, whistleblowers face a lot of challenges. There are a lot of those 11 p.m. WTF moments that Jennifer spoke about, and are they discouraged to speak out? And for some people, when we were speaking with some people who had spoken out within their companies, we were really discouraged from doing it. They said it ruined their lives, as they put it. And we were told, do not do it, it's not worth it. But we were also encouraged by others who had and said it was the most important thing they had ever done. And because we know this information, we have to do it. So that was confusing. But whistleblowers do face many risks. I mean, retaliation, firing, pay cuts, legal exposure. I mean, some of the things we were worried about was one was risk of alienating our peers. It can be really difficult when you really respect your colleagues. And it was hard to say that the employer of many of us that we believed for years was engaging in these misleading practices that did not align with the values that we thought that we shared. And we really worried that speaking out would damage relationships that we'd had for years with many incredible professionals that we worked alongside for years. So that was really challenging, especially when, supportive colleagues are going to stay silent out of self-preservation, which we totally understand, but it can make that process of coming forward feel deeply isolating. We also, of course, were worried about the impact of our future career prospects, how these actions might be perceived by future employers, even in the nonprofit world, and would speaking out make us seem difficult or disloyal? And I spoke to one other leader before coming out who said, yeah, that, all companies have skeletons. And if we come forward with these issues, we probably will have a hard time getting rehired at anywhere else. But we were also told by others that they would hire us no matter what. So that was encouraging. Another thing is, of course, the legal uncertainty. That was intimidating and isolating, and we were deeply grateful to have Jennifer's guidance to help navigate that with confidence. That was extremely helpful, as well as, of course, going into this with my partner was really helpful just to lean on each other. And a couple more was the fear of being misunderstood. Um, there are powerful narratives at play. And when we did come forward, we did see a lot of misrepresentation of what our issue was, straw man arguments that were greatly exaggerating our claims and our recommendations. And so we tried to just not read Yahoo News comments, but we did see a few threads like Y Combinator crowd that were really discouraging. But we also got so much support from folks who were saying thank you so much for coming forward on this. So that was great. And last thing I'll say is just the emotional toll is definitely a risk. I mean, leaving our jobs over this, that was months of deliberation of, is it worth really giving up both of our salaries to this, or should we stay more quiet and try to work from the inside? And kind of this sense of loss of our community and our identity. I mean, I was at Microsoft for 10 years straight out of college, and just this loss of like who I was and what I did for so long, even when you know it's the right thing to do, it is quite emotionally draining. That's what I have.
Jacob or Will, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I've not been through an experience quite as extreme as that. Certainly, when I am considering offering my criticism of OpenAI or other companies where I know people, top of mind is, will I lose friends over this? And I think related to that, I think there's within AI companies, there's definitely a potential bystander effect. A particular company will have a lot of sort of cultural norms and practices that when you have, especially when you've worked somewhere for several years, you start to absorb those. And there's an element of groupthink and an element of, if you see something going wrong, you sort of you say, oh, it's this isn't my job to worry about this. And so I think even before making the decision to come forward, I think there's that's like an additional barrier in a lot of cases.
Jacob, I love that you use the term bystander effect. I've been wrestling with the philosophical exercises of what is the antonym of a whistleblower. I think bystander might be the best term to describe that. On our side, Holly described really well the challenges that we faced, but ultimately we worked for years inside the company, rallying thousands of employees to consensus and presented constructive solutions to senior leadership. And only after those promises that were made to us remained unfulfilled after several years did we make this difficult decision to speak out against the harms. And this was a years-long process, and we spent quite a long time weighing whether the harms that are enabled by this technology outweigh the potential good. And so this equation, it was actually quite clear when we compared the additional annual emissions from just 2 contracts with Exxon and Chevron Mobil against all of Microsoft's carbon footprint. And we realized that it was greater than 3 times that. And then we believe there were many more such of similar contracts. And so this was a decision we did not take lightly, and we have faced many challenges along the way, but I think this is just a moral imperative to speak out against the harms.
Sophie, I might just add, because the 3 panelists, who are all amazing individuals, all did some sort of public speaking up, right? The vast majority of the people I work with don't ever go public, right? For all of these reasons that they're describing and all of the repercussions. When you go public overnight, you can lose half of your friends, right? They're scared to talk to you. They're scared about the kind of knock-on effects. But a lot of the vast majority, I would say, stay anonymous, but that brings its own set of challenges. It's very isolating by virtue of trying to stay anonymous. You can't tell anyone you're doing it. You're trying to therefore navigate it on your own. Will, Jacob, and Holly all were able to do it as collectives. It's one of the things was set up to try to do, is figure out how do you collectivize those working in tech companies to speak up, because it's just much safer on all fronts, including emotionally, to speak up as a collective rather than individually. So having kind of support, especially when you're doing it anonymous, becomes really important. Having someone there who you can get guidance from, who you can talk to, who, when you're feeling particularly low, means you don't go and tell the wrong person, that then creates more risk.
Yeah. Well, I'd add one more thing that gets it, just because it does dovetails right on what Jennifer was just saying, and it goes to one of the questions someone asked in the chat around the mixed messages that I mentioned, around some saying it ruined their lives, some saying it was the best thing they ever did, and kind of what are the trends and the profiles of those folks who had positive or negative experiences. The folks that we spoke with who said it ruined their life or was the worst thing they ever did, they were very solo, and they were individuals who I think did not have this kind of collective power that Jennifer was just speaking to. And the folks that we talked with who said we had to do it, and it was the best thing and most important thing they ever did, they had multiple people that they were coming forward with. And so that just answers that question and dovetails on what Jennifer was saying, and just a huge +1 to that. I think for us, because Will and I had each other, that was extremely powerful. And I don't know if we would have come forward the way we had without each other, but with resources like Jennifer is providing, you can find those other folks that you can have this collective power together and make it the best thing and most important thing you've ever done, and not a huge negative in your life.
Yeah, we've spoken about the kind of community and coworker aspects of this. And Jacob, you mentioned the impact of restrictive agreements when you were introducing yourself. I was wondering if you all could speak a little more to maybe personal experience where corporate culture and kind of the messaging you're receiving from your employer, how did that impact how you thought about whistleblowing? Because that is something being addressed in legislation. And so it'd be interesting to hear about your experience and whether you think that setting out internal processes in legislation would be helpful to combat chilling effects.
I'm happy to go first again. Yeah, we definitely had pressure to stay in the tent, was the terms that were used. As Will mentioned, we worked directly with the senior leadership of the company for years. And the leadership made it clear that we were lucky to be part of these internal conversations and have a seat at the table, but also made it clear that this kind of this unspoken rule, but as long as we stayed quiet, we could keep participating. But the message really was that if we stepped outside of the tent and raised these concerns externally, we would lose that access, and really implicitly our credibility inside the company. And one other thing is that our concerns were consistently deflected or redirected. Anytime that we raised concerns about Microsoft's role in expanding fossil fuel production with those oil companies, the conversation would get redirected towards Microsoft's internal practices and the company's progress in greening its own operations, which were true. They just weren't relevant to our concerns. And it was really just a redirection. And same with highlighting this AI for good initiatives, which again are true. There are great things that AI can be used for sustainability. That's just they're not addressing our concerns and how they are also used for fossil fuel production increases. So it was kind of this constant internal pressure to align with the party line rather than confront these contradictions.
Yeah, I'll add a couple of things. I think the sorts of things that I did see go wrong at OpenAI were things like failures of internal processes where there wasn't necessarily any visible public evidence that something had happened or any harm that was caused. But certainly in the case of AI safety, a very common trope that developers push is this Swiss cheese model where you have multiple safeguards, and that really none of the safeguards is perfectly reliable, and you build up reliability by stacking multiple safeguards. But if internal safeguards fail and that's not visible to the public, the level of safety might be like very overestimated, because the public is not accounting for the fact that yes, there are many safeguards, but if they've been failing a lot, they may not actually have visibility into that. So I think that's one interesting dynamic.
And I just wanted to speak a little more to the social pressures that we faced. Microsoft is a company that we still love, and it has a culture of loyalty and optimism, and it has this strong sense of shared purpose, and it can make dissent seem like betrayal at times, especially if you are challenging the party line or asking the company to live up to its stated values. So that really will suppress desires to work for positive change from within. And I just wanted to emphasize what Holly was saying about the distraction tactics that are employed. If you raise a concern about a harmful use case, it might easily be, oh, but look at the good use case. Or, oh, let's talk about our internal practices in some other area of the company. That doesn't necessarily address the concerns. So this can really lead to significant deflection if those raising the concerns are not collective and very crystal clear about the concerns that they are raising. And there's a lack of clarity about what the even internal governance process of raising those concerns would be. So I think to Jacob's point, there's a lack of internal clarity, and then there's a potential regulatory lack of clarity on what these harms even constitute.
Yeah, I would just add, Sophie, from what I've seen is the risk with internal whistleblowing systems is they're paper systems. They're there to check a box, and they're not there to really address concerns. And it can be really hard as an employee to figure out which it is. And therefore very risky when you use them. But it goes to a culture. If people are if they are real internal mechanisms and the company is serious about listening to people raise concerns, which arguably the best companies are, right? The most successful ones are, then people see action when concerns are committed or submitted to the hotline, and you see a lot of transparency around what's being submitted, how the company's responding. People feel like there's an open culture. With the ones that are just paper, concerns go in and either there's retaliation from the concerns or they just disappear into a hole. And so the risk is always focusing too much on the system and not the culture. because you can put in place lots of systems, but if the culture is not right, the systems aren't going to work.
Very, very true. And kind of in line with what you just said, Jennifer, it would be great to talk about what protections currently exist or fail to exist for whistleblowers when someone reports a potential AI security violation to Congress, to the press, or to government agencies.
Yeah, I'll pick it up and then everyone can jump in if they want. The answer is complicated because there aren't clear protections. There isn't a federal statute protecting those in the AI sector specifically who are speaking out about safety concerns. There's a draft bill that Senator Grassley has tabled. It's important. It needs to move forward urgently. If for no other reason than to signal at the federal level that we think people speaking up is important, right? One of the things legislation does is signal a message to people, and especially when it's whistleblowing laws, it sends signals to those inside companies that they will be protected if they take the risk. There are patchwork protections at the state level, right? And I should say at the federal level, there's also Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank. So some of the AI safety concerns do potentially fit under existing whistleblowing frameworks. It depends on what you're talking about, and without getting into too much granular detail, which one and how and how you would frame it. At the state level, there's different initiatives underway, and you heard me reference SB 53. I saw there were a couple of questions in California. Let me be clear at the outset, it's great there's something, right? So as a step for signaling that California takes AI safety seriously and that it wants to protect those inside companies, it's important. It has a lot of weaknesses, right? It doesn't have a good faith standard. This is my biggest beef with the bill. Every other whistleblowing law has what's called the good faith standard, which says that if you in good faith report something, that is sufficient. You don't have to be correct. And this is really important if you're inside a company and you've got half the picture and you're not really sure and you feel like I need to say something, right? To the Jacob Swiss cheese analogy, which I love, right? Like I'm seeing holes. I'm seeing holes here and I don't know how big they are and I don't know what might fall through the holes. It might be that nothing falls through the holes, but you need to know that if you raise the concern under the legislation, you're going to be protected. That's not the case with SB 53, right? With SB 53, you have to report a foreseeable material harm. That is a really high standard. And then you have to present that it's either going to kill 50 people. This is my other big beef with the bill, or cost $1 billion in damages. If I am inside a company, the most stressful, I always say this, speaking up at whatever level, whether you're going full whistleblower or not, is incredibly traumatizing. You are sitting on your own trying to figure out, I've seen this, I feel like I'm compelled to act. How do I act? Am I blowing up my life? Am I blowing up my career? The last thing you want to be doing is saying, is this going to kill 49 people or 50? I mean, it's slightly ludicrous when you put it that way, right? There's no way to know. And what that provision does in the bill is probably make a lot of people say, I'm not going to take the risk because I don't know if it's 49 or 50. I don't know if it's 10 or 100. I mean, to be fair, we started at 100 with that bill. I think the original draft was you had to kill 100 people. And it got down to 50. The other part of it, the same thing on the damages, right? $1 billion. I don't even know how to calculate damages up to $1 billion, right? I don't think most people do. I don't think most economists could probably help you calculate it when you're talking about a safety issue, right? And so then you're left wondering, well, what if I calculate it as $1 billion or 50? But they argue in court that it's 10 and 100 million. And that's what will happen, right? They will take it to court. Tech companies will take these to court. They do all the time, and they try to limit the scope of the legislation. And when you start giving numbers like that, it becomes a lot easier to do.
If I could add on to that about SB 53, the bill also has a very limited definition of who is a covered employee.
And that's the other part of it.
Yeah, not every employee at an AI company is covered. Subcontractors and subcontractors are not covered. It kind of limits employees working on catastrophic risk only. And then on top of that, it has a narrow definition of what catastrophic risk is. And that's when we get into the material harms that whistleblowers would have to prove that Jennifer was just mentioning. So the ambiguities and the remedies outlined in the statute, the lack of compensatory and punitive damages would lead to further litigation and limit the types of relief available. And so there's a couple whistleblower-based concerns that we have with California SB 53, but happy to see that it's being recognized as important. And
Right. Like the signaling is important, right, Sophie? The signaling is important. You've got to start somewhere. We could have potentially started a bit better, but it means there's lots of work to do.
so, and it also points to the importance of perhaps having a federal AI whistleblower bill. So maybe we can segue into that for what specific gaps in existing whistleblower laws does the AI Whistleblower Protection Act aim to fill?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this will probably, others might have thought, the big thing with the federal whistleblowing around AI, right? And this is the big thing with AI generally. None of it's regulated. Right. So Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank, a lot of the other existing whistleblowing laws focus on wrongdoing, right? So where you've got some sort of legal breach by the company, and that can be in many, many different forms. If nothing is currently illegal in AI, how do you know you're covered? Right? And and how do you know where to report and who to report to? And that's a thing I hear a lot, right? When people working in AI, which is like, it's not illegal, right? It's not illegal. It's not technically wrong, but it's a safety risk. And I think that's really what the federal bill is at its, like at a high level at its core, trying to address. To kind of, make sure that there isn't a question of whether this stuff is covered or not.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. That was definitely a question for us is, this is not illegal what the company is doing. And they never said anything that was a lie directly, but we believe that increasing fossil fuel production, billions of barrels, we believe that is a substantial and specific danger of the deployment of artificial intelligence that poses a public health risk. So yeah, it was definitely a gray area and kind of still is. So I'm glad we're working through this because we believe there is a risk, but how does that fall into our current regulations?
To your point, Sophie, about contrasting SB 53 with the federal legislation, right? The federal legislation would cover everyone, not this really narrow section of workers. And it would include contractors or red teams that might come in, right? Which are not covered under SB 53. So it's a much broader catch-all. It would SB 53 would not cover Holly and Will, right? But the federal legislation would. And often you find like it may not be the engineers who spot the concern. It might be the policy folks, the privacy folks, or people adjacent to the engineering teams, or coming in externally on projects. And you want to make sure anyone who's seeing something that's concerning can say something.
Yeah, I think another question here is where the whistleblower reports go. Like ideally, the law enforcement agency or other system to set up to receive the complaints would have the appropriate like technical expertise and even like the authority to actually like take actions as a result. And that aspect of it is certainly much better if that's done at the federal level, where there's already beginning to be some technical capacity built out in the US KC, and we don't want to have 50 different 50 different organizations like that, that'd obviously be much too difficult to set up. I don't think I don't think there's anything specific in the whistleblower bill right now about who the reports go to beyond I think reporting to Congress or any kind of general law enforcement agency. It doesn't mandate a specific place to send things, but it's definitely a very good step in that direction.
I believe it sends you to the Department of Labor.
Got it. Thanks.
Will, did you have anything to add? I saw you were unmuted earlier.
I just wanted to follow up to Holly and Jennifer's points. Climate change is a clear, foreseeable, and material risk to humanity with up to trillions of dollars in damages. And we are raising a fairly straightforward, harmful use case of AI, and it is still not covered. So we urgently need to expand the definition of these risks to include planetary risks, because there's not a far link to connect planetary risks with human rights.
Could you talk a little bit about, is there something about whistleblowing in the AI space that is uniquely risky or important compared to other industries, or is whistleblowing in this field the same as what you'd find in other industries?
I'm happy to start on that one. I think AI in particular poses a few distinct challenges. One of the most obvious ones is the pace at which the technology is advancing. You can certainly there's risks posed by any new technology, but AI in particular is advancing very rapidly, and also it's in an unpredictable way. I think the understanding of AI systems often lags the engineering in a way that's not necessarily. It's sometimes in other fields it's the other way around. We can't necessarily. Even the best experts can't tell you what AIs will be able to do next year or the year after that. It's also a very nascent industry with few established standards. There's not necessarily an agreed upon, this is the right way to do things, this is the wrong way to do things. I think in general, there are like potential catastrophic risks posed by the technology as it like continues to kind of rapidly improve in capability.
And I just wanted to emphasize what Jacob was saying. Things are moving quickly. There is tremendous pressure to ship, and sometimes safety decisions will be compromised under those commercial incentives. And Karen Howe's book, Empire of AI, really clearly outlines some classic cases of failure here. So just creating that agility to really respond to the development of the technology will be crucial. And I wanted to commend the EU AI Act because it has a much more clear definition of high-risk systems, including categories that might be flagged, which would be very helpful for any employees who are able to clearly identify risks and then flag them.
Although it currently still does not include environmental risk as a high risk scenario, and that's something we're hoping to work on with our enabled emissions campaign. We didn't actually bring that up yet, that when we quit, we didn't just quit out of protest, which is again one of those things that kind of got misconstrued in the public, but we left to start a campaign on this issue because we believe it is that important that we need external pressure. So it's called the Enabled Emissions Campaign. But that's one of the things we want to do is see if we can amend the EU AI Act to include environmental risk as a human harm, as we believe it absolutely is.
And we're lucky that there is precedent for industry-specific AI we're lucky that there is industry-specific whistleblower protections that can be applied and followed as standard when addressing whistleblowers in the AI industry. We saw that with nuclear energy in the 1978 Energy Reorganization Act. The federal government employees were covered under the 1989 Whistleblower Protection Act. airline employees under Air 21 in 2000, and Dodd-Frank in 2010 aimed to address Wall Street workers. So we have precedent with whistleblower law for addressing specific industries. My next question is, how should federal government agencies, Congress, and courts prepare for a wave of AI-related disclosures?
They're not prepared. I mean, it's a complicated one, right? So the presumption there is that the disclosures are going to wind up in court, right? And coming out through courts. I think you're going to see a lot of the AI disclosures happening in different ways, in different routes. And I think it's really important that there be different routes for people who are trying to speak up to go. And that includes everything from going to a regulator who knows what they're talking about, Jacob talked about, or someone who knows what they're talking about, but also, Congress or state level, depending on the state, or in certain cases, the media might be the route you need to or have to or choose to go, right? So where you're going to see courts come into the AI disclosures, I think, is when employees unfortunately start getting sued by their employers for disclosures. Or, there might be other legal battles which we can set aside, which are not part of this discussion, right? And in that case, I think we're going to see the same challenges we see with any scientific disclosures in court systems. It's going to become a battle of the experts, right? You're going to see disclosures come out in court. You're going to see companies. The other thing I should say is I suspect if you find companies in litigation, and this might be why the companies, we've talked a lot about law as a protection for speaking up. There are other forms of protection. And I often talk to people about, what does the law say? What's your legal risk here? Holly will know this. And what's your actual risk, right? What is the risk the company decides to invoke whatever right they have in this context? I'll give you a really good example. If you are going to a senator with your disclosure, you may or may not be covered under a statute for that disclosure, right? You probably are. I mean, make an argument you are, but you may not be, depending on the information and what you're going with. It is really unlikely a company is going to sue you in a courtroom for talking to a senator about a concern you have related to safety at a company, because that senator has the ability to regulate that company, right? Doesn't mean it's no risk, but there are different thresholds of risk. There are similarly when you're talking to the media. But related to the kind of risk calculation along the legal calculation is you also need someone to help walk you through the system even when there are laws. And I'm deviating a little bit from your question, Sophie, because I think really it's going to become a battle of the experts. And to Jacob's point, even in the whistleblowing space, what we need to do is have more expertise on hand, right? So we talk about bringing people in to help consult on cases when they're incredibly technical, right? But keeping all of that under privilege. So the whistleblower is still protected, but they can get the expert advice they need to understand what their options are. Courts are going to have to do that too. And historically, battle of the experts in courtrooms comes down to who has the most money, which is not great, is a little bit cynical, but courts are going to be really ill prepared to deal with AI, I think.
Yeah, in terms of how regulatory agencies and governments can prepare, I definitely, echoing the point I made about state capacity. This is important not just for receiving whistleblower complaints, but for engaging in third-party testing. This is already starting to happen with the memorandums of understanding with the USKC, but certainly, I think by comparison, I think the UK is leading the way in this respect. They have a much larger institute, the AI Security Institute, with a couple, I think probably a couple hundred people there, and I think perhaps the US should be following that example in terms of really investing in state capacity to actually do things and work with labs who have thousands and thousands of employees.
Glenn, to your point, Jacob, build the institutes who can set the standards, right? That makes it easier for the courts, right? If there's set standards, which we don't have right now.
Yeah, I think it just makes a lot of things easier if there's actual capacity and technical expertise inside government.
And I just wanted to recount a governance structure that we were using within Microsoft. It was just three simple steps: people, process, and tools. So Jennifer had really clarified some of the people aspects, but getting the right teams in place. Next would be the process, the governance, the resolving any procedural challenges within the courts, or just understanding where you fall within that disclosure cycle. And then finally, tools for actual enforcement. And I really think that this might be lacking. And even another example would be monitoring these systems in production and standards associated with that, which are nascent, to say it lightly. And even just mandated transparency on the data used to train the models. There are so many different complex pieces here. I would just only feel confident in good execution of this if the right people were at the helm.
Thank you. We've been able to integrate some audience questions so far with SB 53 and a couple other issues, but it seems like people are really resonating with discussions of collectivizing, speaking out, and building support systems for whistleblowers. So could we talk a little bit more about what kind of vehicles can be put in place to facilitate that?
I can tell you what we're doing, and then these guys can chime in. One of the challenges to collectivizing is, how do you find people, right? So without risking everything and walking around the company going, who else is concerned about this issue? How do you find people? And also in an environment in which things can be quite siloed, how do you find the commonalities? So .org set up in part not just to be a place that tech workers could go to get independent pro bono free advice on how to structure their journey very early on, right? I always tell people, so if there's anyone listening who's thinking about talking, the earlier you start planning before speaking, the smoother it's going to go. To Holly's point about the people who say it ruined their lives versus those who didn't. I think there's a question in the chat about, once you wind up in litigation, the earlier you can get advice, the more you can try to mitigate risk, to make the process go hopefully more smoothly. But to the point about collectivizing, one of the things we are doing is building a safe where people will be able to go and say, I want immediate legal advice on what I'm seeing and what my options might be. Or I'm not quite there yet, but I've got a real concern. It's 11 o'clock at night and I've just done this. I'm going to deposit the information here. It's going to remain encrypted. Don't decrypt it unless I match with another concern that's been deposited. So unless another employee raises a similar concern and there might be potential for us to act collectively, then I want to talk to a lawyer, right? And the system keeps everything encrypted until that match happens. And in that way, tries to help give people a mechanism to find each other with their concerns and to give people somewhere they can go and deposit the concern, so that if they don't want to do something right now, but they want to do something in 4 months or 5 months, they can come back to it. And in that way, trying to find ways of connecting people inside companies or across the industry who might have similar concerns, who might then be able to speak with multiple voices rather than one. Because the great thing about collectiveness, and I've seen it with Holly and Will, I've seen it with other collectives I've worked with, is one, it's much easier to protect them, right? So take the simple question of if a collective is working with a journalist, it becomes much harder for the company to figure out who shared what with whom, when. It often allows for one person who has the ability to take the risk to be the spokesperson and everyone else to stay in the background, because people have different things going on in their life. Some people can take risks, some people can't take risks at any time. It provides that emotional support. But the other thing it does is it takes away the corporate playbook. The corporate playbook, and I just went through this a few weeks ago with one of my clients is the head of security, former head of security for WhatsApp, right? The first thing the company did, the first thing Meta did was say, he had performance issues. He was a bad employee. This is a problematic employee, right? This is the corporate playbook. The minute one person speaks up, they attack the person. And that's all they do. You could almost write the script for how they're going to respond to the disclosures. They never deal with the disclosures. They always attack the person. When it's a collective, it's much harder to attack the person, right? Because it's not one person, it's multiple people. And in many ways, they're then forced to address the issues being raised. And what I always say is they're forced to address the message, not the messenger.
Yeah, maybe I'll add a few thoughts. I think in situations I've kind of seen, there's less of an issue that there aren't, like, you maybe know that there are other people who are sympathetic, but there may be just kind of legal tactics that the company has employed, like to make it hard to communicate with other people. So, for example, in the non-disparagement agreement that I was given, I wasn't allowed to disclose the existence of the agreement to anyone else. So, I was kind of on my own trying to make this decision. I would have loved to have chatted to people who'd been in the same situation to hear what they did, and definitely like having support from orgs like PSST, where they can set you up with a lawyer and things like that, is definitely a great step for even figuring out how to navigate those kind of issues. And I think we're seeing also even now, thankfully those aggressive exit agreements have been cancelled, but there are still pretty aggressive tactics being employed that can have a similar effect. So we recently saw some rather aggressive subpoenas from OpenAI at various nonprofits, and I think when you receive something like that, all of a sudden now top of mind is like, well, anything I say is maybe covered by the subpoena. Maybe I have to be careful with who, even if you have nothing to hide, you maybe feel very like any kind of communication now has this overhead that you have to worry about. And I think that's sadly a tactic that companies can use. Whether or not that was the intent, I won't speak to, but certainly the effect I would expect is there.
Just to add on to what Jacob said about the NDAs, if you ask me where the gaps are in the federal whistleblowing legislation, it's that it doesn't address. NDAs have become pervasive in businesses, but particularly in tech. I mean, the last stat I saw was potentially as many as 72% of people inside tech companies have had to sign NDAs at some point, right? The NDAs don't just come with a non-disclosure. They're not about trade secrets anymore, right? It's about protecting the brand. And so they come with really onerous clauses around non-disparagement, which basically means you can't talk about the company, but also are mandatory arbitration clauses. And those mandatory arbitration clauses are a killer for people wanting to speak up, because the one thing that might stop a company from going after someone's breaking their NDA is the bad press that would come from going after the person breaking the NDA. The minute you add a mandatory arbitration clause, everything's done in secret. So you can sue someone, Sarah Wynne Williams being a very good example, in March, and it's all happening behind closed doors, right? And the person is effectively gagged while it's happening. And we've got to get back to a place where NDAs are about protecting trade secrets and not about protecting the brand, especially when it comes to getting at safety concerns inside AI companies.
My final question, which I will ask be responded in a rapid fire manner as we are running towards the end of our time together, is how do whistleblowers protect their safety after a public legal process has already commenced?
It's hard. It goes to my point earlier about, and I know this is not helpful once you find yourself there, right? But part of what we're trying to do is make sure people know there's somewhere you can go very early on and get advice. Because once you're in litigation, it becomes really difficult. It doesn't mean there aren't things that can be done. It doesn't mean I used to do something called impact litigation. We talked about the court of law and the court of public opinion. Doesn't mean you can't use the storytelling component, and that's why we have a storytelling component at PSST, and we have experts in kind of communications and storytelling, because you might be able to take the litigation into the public debate and the public sphere and try to mitigate some of the damage in that way. It really depends on the case, though. But it's hard once you're there, and the aim is always to try not to get there. And that's why planning becomes so important. And I would say planning before you even talk to, to our earlier point, pulling it around the internal hotlines, which are not always safe. I'll be very diplomatic in my language. Before you even go to the internal hotline, right? Before you say boo, talk to someone, find out what are your risks here and what's the least risky path.
You can see why we were very glad to have Jennifer through this process. I just want to say, I guess just final thoughts on my side is just a huge thank you to Jennifer and her team. It's been incredibly helpful to have her and her team as a resource through this, and I just wish we had connected with her earlier. I think it took us a while to get to that point, and I hope that folks watching this or who are in this space can know that there are resources out there and can maybe help them feel more confident to move forward more quickly, especially as we've talked about throughout this panel. The threats with AI are just happening so rapidly that we just can't afford to wait. So thank you to her. And also just a last thing about this, the bad press for suing someone, that was kind of on our side as well, that these issues are often ones that the companies don't want to come out. Microsoft and these other tech companies have done a very, very fantastic job of keeping these contracts quiet for a long time. People don't know that some of Microsoft's largest customers are oil companies. And so they kind of want to keep that quiet. So that's been on our side. But yes, that just a big thank you to Jennifer. And that's all from me.
Thank you to, maybe this is a way to wrap it up, is a huge thank you to all three of you. I see it from the other side. I sometimes live it with you. I know how hard it is, right? I know you all, I think the misconception, you all love your jobs, right? And you're probably some of the most dedicated employees a company could have. And to get to the point where you then have to speak up can be quite daunting. But it's incredibly important for the public to know what's going on inside these companies, especially when it's potentially harmful.
And if you are concerned, it's highly likely that many others are also sharing these same concerns. So build community. That's, I think, the biggest takeaway that I'd like to leave the audience with. Social currency can support you through any challenges here.
Jacob, any final remarks?
I think Will's final thought was a great closing comment.
Yeah. This has been great. Thank you so much to Americans for Responsible Innovation for bringing us together to speak on these issues. It's really a testament to how important it is to discuss what's going on, what protections are needed, and also why education is needed. So people, when they realize that they're witnessing something that may be a violation or just doesn't feel quite right, they know that they have paths forward. Even now, when we don't have a federal standard yet for coming forward, there are paths forward. It doesn't have to get to the point where you're public, everyone knows your name. There are ways to report anonymously with existing legislation. And it's so important that people in the industry and all industries are aware of this. So thank you so much again to all of our panelists. Thank you, Will, Holly, Jennifer, Jacob, and all of our attendees. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. Thank you.